The March First movement,
the fight for independence and for freedom.
植民地支配をするという時代はもう終わりだと。
Paris Peace Conference.
Mao Zedong felt that Wilson had betrayed people in different parts of the world.
the spirit of revolution for independence.
Global upheaval in 1919.
Tapgol Park. I remember coming here when I was little. My parents told me this is where the Declaration of Independence was read aloud during the March 1st movement in 1919. 독립선언서. 우리는 이에 조선이 독립한 나라임과 조선 사람이 자주적인 민족임을 선언한다. I remember being terrified as a kid. To think that people were not afraid to sacrifice their lives, fight for independence, when it was so obvious that they will be crushed by the armed Japanese forces. How could they be so willing?
In 1905, the Empire of Japan forced Korea to sign the Ulsa Restriction Treaty, thereby completely depriving Korea of its rights to conduct diplomacy. Then, in 1910, the Korea-Japan Annexation Treaty was signed. The Empire of Japan had annexed Korea. The people of Korea continued their fight for independence against Japan, both in Korea and abroad. On February 1st, 1919, the Declaration of Independence was announced in the name of the 39 independence fighters active in Manchuria. On February 8, 1919, Korean students studying in Japan announced the Declaration of Independence in Tokyo. On March 1, 1919, the Declaration of Independence was read aloud in Seoul. The Korean people cried out for independence and began a peaceful demonstration. The March 1st movement that started in Seoul continued through the Korean independence activists abroad, in the US, Russia, Mexico, and Germany, well into the next year.
To find an answer, I decided to reach out to experts and get their insights on the March 1st movement. First, I got in contact with Professor Wada Haruki, dubbed the acting conscience of Japan.
植民地支配する、列強が、帝国主義国が植民地支配をするという時代はもう終わりだと。これはもう続けられないということを宣言したわけです。韓国は。韓国の国民が。
제국주의와 식민주의에서 나타나던 이익을 서로 쟁탈하고 경쟁하던 그 결과가 1차 세계대전으로 마무리되어지고 1차 세계대전이 끝난 이후에 승전국들 사이에서 이러한 제국주의와 식민주의에 대한 이권을 어떻게 나눌 것인가에 대한 논의가 국제사회에서 나타나고 있었습니다.
Then a couple of months later, you get the May 4th movement in China. And there's also, over the course of 1919, protests against colonialism in India and Egypt and numerous other parts of the world.
네, 교수님 안녕하세요. 보내주신 자료 잘 봤는데 너무 흥미로운 자료들인 것 같아요. As for how the Chinese reacted and responded at the time, I talked to Professor Sun Keus, who has long been studying the history of Korea's fight for independence.
五四运动前后呢，中国呢一直受到西方列强和日本帝国主义的侵略，也对韩国人民 要求独立的这种革命运动呢，只予以高度的评价。这一篇呢是发表在国民日报的一个新闻，它的消息来源呢是路透社的消息来源。据前列队游行各街道，欢呼高丽独立，切欲逮捕诸学生，诸学生大呼曰：3月5日之后呢，中国各地的报纸几乎每天都在报道3一运动的进展情况。
I also tried to see if the March 1st movement was reported in other countries, and I found several articles in the newspapers of Mexico, the US, Russia, and many more. Why were media outlets in other parts of the world interested in Korea's March 1st movement? Thank you very much for making the time today. Upon learning how the story was also reported by one of the then Czechoslovak press, I decided to meet with the current ambassador of the Czech Republic to South Korea.
Czechoslovakia was a part of Austro-Hungarian monarchy who lost in the First World War. Korea was really far away from Czechoslovakia. But there was one thing which basically connected Korea to Czechoslovakia, and that was the fight for independence and for freedom.
The ambassador showed me how the story about the March 1st movement was published not just once, but several times on Deník, a newspaper published by the Czechoslovak Legion.
Almost every issue is printed at a different place because it was printed on the train which was moving around. And in this issue, Reuters reported from Seoul that Koreans gathered in masses and demanded Korea's independence. The police and military took various measures to prevent the movement from spreading. And there is an issue about Japan and Korea, and that Japan doesn't want any press about the first March movement.
New Zealand in 1919 was part of the British Empire. We were not a fully independent country at that stage. So I think that the news of the Korean independence movement would have been read with great interest by a large number of people in New Zealand. Here is a copy of the newspaper article at the time. So it's called Rising in Korea, Anti-Japanese Movement, 4,000 Arrests, Demand for Independence.
Namaste.
Professor Santosh Ranjan, who's been doing research on the topic of exchanges between Korea and India at the time of their fight for independence, said he was in Korea, so I decided to pay him a visit. So, Professor, how did India first come across the news of Korea's March 1st movement?
First report about the March 1st movement in Indian media reported in May 1919 of Modern Review Journal, and this is the article you can see, and the same article also wished the Korea to be success. 29 people locked inside a church and they were burned, and they were killed by Japanese military, and the whole village was burned by the Japanese military. And this Cheamni massacre reminds me Indian massacre, which popularly known as the Jallianwala Bagh Amritsar massacre, which took place in 13 April 1919. In this, more than 1,000 Indian civilians were brutally killed by the British Army.
Japan's suppression of Korea's fight for independence was a shared pain for other countries fighting for their own independence around the same time. Despite the oppression they faced, those countries continued their independence movements and sent representatives to the Paris Peace Conference. The Paris Peace Conference was held on January 18, 1919. This conference was held among the Allied powers in order to establish peace terms with the defeated Central Powers.
Wilson had pledged that after World War I, there would be an end to entangling alliances, there would be freedom of seas, and most importantly for many people in the colonial world, that there would be self-determination and sovereignty. And so Wilson's ideas really had a tremendous influence. They were very inspiring to people in many different parts of the world who were suffering under the yoke of colonialism at the time.
Korea also decided to send a delegate. They sent Kim Kyusik, who was fluent in English, French, and German. Kim Kyusik arrived in Paris on March 13, 1919. He established the Korean Information Bureau and the Korean Communications Agency for the Paris Peace Conference, and shared the news of the March 1st movement against Japan's imperialist oppression of Korea. He explained the justification for Korea's independence to the French press and to the delegates from 27 other countries attending the conference. On May 10th the same year, he submitted a petition for Korea's independence at the Paris Peace Conference, demanding that Korea's sovereignty be restored, and he requested a seat at the table. His efforts, however, proved futile.
Most of the great powers were very sympathetically inclined towards Japan and didn't really want to help China or Korea or any other country that was a victim of colonialism. Remember, at the time, this was a world in which colonialism was one of the, dominant political realities.
I got curious. Were the Korean independence fighters so oblivious to the world order at the time to think that their representatives' voice will be heard at the Paris Peace Conference? I decided to pose this question to Professor Chang Seok-keung, an expert on Korea's independence movement history.
김규식 선생이 상당히 보수적이랍니다. 그래서 외국인들과 가까워지질 않는데 그렇게 가까워질 수 있었던 거는 에밀 블라베의 소개로. 그래서 이제 그 프랑스의 한국 독립운동을 돕는 그런 분들이 많이 나타났다라는 그 파리에서 한국 대표부가 근무할 수 있게끔 그 집을 제공해 준 분들이에요. 당초부터 승전국의 식민지는 그 의제에서 삭제된다는 걸 알고 있었고 파리 강화회의 의제로 상정되지 않더라도 선전 활동을 통해서 한국 독립 문제를 세계에 알려야 되겠다. 1917년에 대동단결 선언이 발표가 됩니다. 근데 이 대동단결 선언의 요지를 보면은 1차 대전이 이제 끝나갈 무렵이 되니까 그 강화회의가 열릴 것이다. 그때 우리는 대표를 파견해야 되고 그러기 위해서는 정부도 만들어야 된다. 그리고 국민적인 그 반일 운동이 거대하게 일어나야 된다라고.
就是说呢，在韩国呢，大部分韩国人认为呢，三一运动的爆发呢，是因为呢，因为美国总统威尔逊的民族自决主义，但是呢，其实这是一个我认为是一个历史的误。我们说远的说呢，可以说从1905年呢，韩国人争取独立的斗争一直都没有停止过。1910年日本吞并韩国之后呢，很多韩国人呢，就是不管是在国内也好，在海外也好，都一直在坚持独立运动，都坚持呢，用自己的各种行动呢，来争取韩国的独立。
On November 17, 1905, Korea was forced to sign the Ulsa Restriction Treaty. This completely deprived Korea of its rights to conduct diplomacy. Emperor Gojong sent letters pleading for help to Russia, Germany, and other countries, but heard nothing back. The Empire of Japan, which had won the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, made sure that Russia could not interfere with its colonization of Korea by signing the Treaty of Portsmouth on September 5, 1905. Then on August 12, 1905, the Anglo-Japanese alliance was renewed to guarantee that Japan and Britain would keep their colonies, India for Britain and Korea for Japan. And on July 29th the same year, the Taft-Katsura Treaty was signed between Japan and the United States to secure Korea for Japan and the Philippines for the U.S.
これ密約というようなもんじゃなくて、これは公然たる約束ですけど、その時期は帝国主義の全盛の時代でした。ですから、帝国主義国は小さな戦争で勢力圏を拡大し、かつお互いにその勢力圏を尊重して、連携していると、そういう状況にあったわけです。
I think the United States was not very eager to help Korea at the time for a variety of different reasons. I think, first of all, if you look at the ideas of Theodore Roosevelt, who was president of the United States, he was actually very supportive of colonialism. He believed, for instance, that the United States had recently established an empire for itself in the Philippines, and that this was very important to the United States and something that the United States had a right and even an obligation to do.
The struggle of Korean people for independence aroused big sympathy and a sense of solidarity between, among the Korean people have been fighting for 15 years against Japanese robbers who took away their land, deprived them of independence, executed, imprisoned their best sons and daughters, and put them in prison.
Kim Kyusik, who gave all his efforts to advertise Korea's fight for independence to the world, gathered the strength of representatives from around 30 other nations that had lost their sovereignty, including Ho Chi Minh from Vietnam. Together, they submitted their petitions for independence to the Paris Peace Conference. But again, their petitions were rejected. However, through this, a close alliance was formed between the activists of the colonized countries.
Well, I think this was really a moment in history that could have been transformative. It was in many ways a transnational movement with with nationalists in the colonial world protesting against imperial powers.
On June 28, 1919, a peace treaty was signed between the Allied powers, which had won World War I, and Germany. This is known as the Treaty of Versailles, having been signed at the Palace of Versailles in France.
Because we'd sent 10% of our people to fight in that war, our Prime Minister believed that we should be represented at that conference, and he was insistent on that. But there was a debate. Many of the bigger countries said, New Zealand, you're not a full country, you shouldn't be there. But he won the debate, and he travelled to Paris, joined in the peace conference, and in fact, he, as New Zealand, became the 17th person to sign the Treaty of Versailles.
Germany, as a losing nation of the war, was ordered to release its colonies. Among the winning Allied powers, Britain, France, and Belgium, along with the Union of South Africa, replaced Germany's colonial power over Cameroon, as well as what is now Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi in East Africa, and what is now Namibia in Southwest Africa.
힘의 논리, 그리고 승자의 법칙이 작용하고 있었다라고 볼 수 있죠. 베르사유 회의, 파리 강화회담에서도 강대국, 5대 강국들이라고는 이제 이 영국, 프랑스, 이탈리아, 미국, 일본들은 표결권이 2표씩 있었어요. 그리고 이제 나머지 참여국들 22개국은 이제 1표씩.
One of the other aspects of that treaty was that some parts of the previous German Empire were given to other countries to manage. And New Zealand was given Samoa, which at that stage had been a German colony in the South Pacific, to manage for the next while as a mandate. And unfortunately, New Zealand did not do a good job. There were many instances of poor decisions, neglect, and personal tragedy, which caused some hardship to the Samoans. Samoa did not become independent from New Zealand until 1962. And in 2002, our former Prime Minister Helen Clark actually issued a formal apology to the people of Samoa for the way that New Zealand had managed it.
I became aware that the Paris Peace Conference made the issues over territories and colonies more complicated until the mid-20th century.
승전국들은 자신들의 이익을 그대로 챙겨가게 되면서 자본주의 내에서의 무한 경쟁들이 시작이 되는 거죠. 근데 그 안에서 수요와 공급을 제대로 조절할 수 있는 기능들이 작동을 하지 않게 되고 이 부분들이 이제 대공황으로 이어지는 부분이 있고요. 대공황을 겪으면서 이제 독일도 굉장히 어려워졌을 뿐만 아니라 일본도 상황이 굉장히 어려워지면서 대외적인 팽창을 시작하게 되고 이게 이제 2차 세계대전으로 이어지거든요.
世の中も世界の趨勢は変わっている。単一独立宣言によって変わっている。韓国自身がそういうことを日本に言ってきてるにもかかわらず、それは全然聞いてない。自分たちはうまくやったというふうに思っていて、だからこの道をずっと行こうということで、シベリアにも攻め込んだし、それから満州にも攻め込んだし、中国本土にも攻め込んでいくというふうに、ずっともう、敗戦ですね。そして降伏ということになる。50年間アジアに侵略してきて、それが完全な敗北になって、国土は焼け野原になるという状況になって、原爆も2発も落ちるという状況になって、戦争が終わったと。こうなったんです。成功したものは失敗すると。こういうふうになるのは、ほとんどアイロニーじゃなくて、ほとんど原則でしょうね。法則じゃありませんか、それが。
I became curious. How has the world changed since the year 1919 when the winners decided the fate of the defeated?
Formal colonialism no longer exists to, the degree or anywhere near the extent that it existed in 1919. But nonetheless, obviously, the world hasn't completely changed.
Unfortunately, we see kind of deterioration of the multilateral status of the especially organizations recently.
코로나가 오면서 아주 명확히 드러났던 게 유엔뿐만 아니라 WHO를 비롯한 국제기구들이 작동을 안 한 거예요.
つまり、帝国主義の時代はもう去っているが、しかし力のある者は力を劣っている力の弱い国に対して圧力を加えるというようなことは起こりうるわけで、それはやめてもらいたい。そういうことはやめてもらいたいということですね。
I think the message of the proclamation of Korean independence is as relevant today as it ever was. It talks about witnessing the equality of all nations and passing that on to posterity as their inherent right. It talks about avoiding aggression, oppression, authoritarianism. Now, these concepts are very relevant to the world today.
The year 2021. We are still witnessing nationalism and a tug of war over COVID-19 vaccines at a time when global solidarity has never been more important. And there are still countless conflicts happening all around the world. 서대문 Prison History Hall. This is where many Korean independence fighters, including Yu Kwan-sun, who took part in the March 1st movement at the mere age of 16, were tortured and executed by the Japanese forces. What would they have wished for as they took their last breath?
금일 5인의 소임은 다만 자기의 건설이 유할 뿐이요 결코 타의 파괴에 재치 아니하도다.
구사상 구세력에 폐기된 일본 이전가의 공명적 희생이 된 부자연, 우 불합리한 착오 상태를 개선 광정하여 자연, 우 합리한 정경대원으로 기원케 함이로다.
We herewith proclaim the independence of Korea and the liberty of the Korean people.
We tell it to the world in witness of the equality of all nations, and we pass it on to our posterity as their inherent right.
세계의 변조를 승한 오인은 아무 주저할 것도 없으며 아무 기탄할 것도 없도다.
Let the day we take hold be the day of our attainment. In this hope we go forward.
今日我々が朝鮮独立を図るのは、朝鮮人に対しては民族の正当なる 尊栄を獲得させるものであると同時に、日本に対しては邪悪なる道より出て東洋の支持者たるの重責を全うさせるものであり、
세계 평화, 인류 행복에 필요한 계단이 되게 하는 것이다.
Let all things be done decently and in order.
오인의 주장과 태도로 하여금 어디까지든지 광명정대하게 하라. 조선 건국 4252년 3월 1일